there are two different stories of the birth of Jesus that have come down to us in the pages of the Bible. One is told in the Gospel of Matthew, the other in the Gospel of Luke. And they are really quite different stories. They're different in tone, they're different in content to a certain extent, they are different in approach. Nevertheless, down through the centuries, Christians have been in the habit of taking these two rather different stories and blending them together, just throwing it all into one narrative. And that is why, for example, we just assume that the wise men, the Magi, came to visit Jesus at the manger. We assume that despite the fact that Matthew says very clearly that they came to visit him in a house. It doesn't mention a manger at all. And I long believe that this habit we have of taking these two different stories and mixing them together really does a disservice to both of them. I mean, imagine you had a beautiful hot cup of coffee in this hand, a perfect cup of coffee. And in this hand you had a nice cold glass of champagne. And before drinking them, you just took them and mixed them together. The result might be drinkable, barely, but neither drink is made to be consumed that way, is it? And you kind of spoil both of them by just mixing them together mindlessly. They are meant to be savored individually on their own merits. And I think that's exactly the approach we need to take to the stories of the birth of Jesus. Let each one speak for itself. And that is why during this Christmas season I will be preaching and speaking only on the version of the story of Jesus' birth found in the Gospel of Luke. It's not that I don't like Matthew's story. It is very beautiful, very meaningful. It's just that I want to savor Luke's story. Let it speak for itself and focus on what Luke has to tell us, that it means that Jesus came into the world. Now, there is one very special thing about the Gospel of Luke that sets it apart from all the others. For Luke, alone among the Gospel writers, seems to have believed that once he had finished writing his Gospel story, he was not done. And sometime later, he took up his pen again and he continued the story in a second volume, the book that we know as the Book of the Acts of the Apostles. And you may think that the Acts, as we call it, is just a story about the life of the early church, that it is nothing to teach us about Christmas. But actually it does. It has one very important thing to teach us about Christmas. Now you all know the story as it's told in Luke's Gospel. How Luke says that Jesus was born in the midst of a census, that Caesar Augustus decided to hold a census to count all the people, and that this census provoked a mass migration of people. The people got up and went back to the places where their ancestors had come from. That's the story that's told. But Luke, in the book of Acts, adds one more little detail to that narration, an important detail. And it happens almost in passing. The apostles have been arrested in Jerusalem. They've been arrested basically for disturbing the peace, because all over the place they're preaching and telling the story about Jesus and what has happened to him. And the elders in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin, the official council of elders, is upset about this, and they arrest the apostles and bring them in for questioning. But this is still early in the life of the church. And these elders don't quite know what to do with these apostles. And they're kind of puzzled, and so at some point in the meeting, they put the apostles out of the room so that they can discuss among themselves privately. And it is at this point that one of the elders, a revered teacher named Gamaliel, steps forward and says something important. Now, it's kind of interesting that there were no Christians in the room when this was said, which leads us to ask, well, how on earth did Luke know what they said in this private, in-camera session? I can only assume that Luke would say that he was told by the Holy Spirit. But however Luke knew, what Gamaliel says to the Sanhedrin, the Council of Elders, is this. He starts talking about the movement around Jesus and comparing it to other movements that had gone before it. And one of the movements he compares it to is the movement around a rebel by the name of Judas the Galilean. And this is what Gamaliel says about Judas. Judas the Galilean rose up at the time of the census and got people to follow him. He also perished, and all who followed him were scattered. Now that's all that's said about Judas the Galilean in the Bible. But we actually know a fair bit about this fellow, Judas the Galilean, because the story of his rebellion is told in a book written by a first-century historian named Flavius Josephus. So we know that Judas the Galilean did rebel against Rome, and he did it in the year 6 AD. He did it while a census was being taken, the first census that was taken in Judea, under the direction of Quirinius, the governor of the province of Syria. But the interesting thing about Luke, and the little detail he adds about this, is that when he talks about what Judas the Galilean did, he mentions that he did it during the census. And when Judas says, the census, I have to ask, which census? Because Luke seems to be assuming that we should know which census he's talking about. Which leads me to assume that the census that he's referring to is the only census that he mentions anywhere else in his writings. That is to say, the census that was taken at the time when Jesus was born, which Luke describes as the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. So in a sense, what Luke is doing here is he's adding another character to his nativity story. This Judas the Galilean. Luke is saying that this person was active, did something at the time when Jesus was born. I find that fascinating because, down through the years, we as Christians, down through the centuries, have felt free to add all kinds of characters to the nativity story. So we talk about an innkeeper, not mentioned in the Bible, but we talk about him. We talk about a donkey who was also not mentioned in the Bible, and a little drummer boy, and other characters have been added to the Christmas story over the years. But here in the book of Acts, Luke actually adds another character to the Christmas story as well. This Judas of Galilee. And yet, we've forgotten all about him. And I think we should remember him. Because I think the introduction of Judas the Galilean into the Christmas story changes the whole thing and how we need to understand it. How do we think of the story? I mean, the particular part of the story that interests me is the story of the journey of Mary and Joseph from Nazareth in Galilee to Bethlehem in Judea. When we think about that journey, we think about it as a long and difficult journey, no doubt. It's 110 kilometers from Nazareth to Bethlehem. But of course, Mary and Joseph would have gone a long way around. And the journey likely would have taken them many weeks to make, at least. But at least, we usually assume, at least that journey was made in relative safety. At least the roads were peaceful and untroubled. At least that's what we assume. But maybe we shouldn't assume that. Because in the book of Acts, Luke tells us that at that very time, while that census was on, while Mary and Joseph were making that journey, there was a rebellion going on. that Judas the Galilean was carrying out a rebellion, and I gotta tell you, the epicenter of that rebellion would have been on the very roads between Judea and Galilee that Mary and Joseph were traveling down. Luke is aware that that's what was going on. It's got to make you wonder. Why would Mary and Joseph embark on such a dangerous journey at such a very dangerous time? Because honestly, that is one part of the story that has never made a great deal of historical sense. I mean, the way that Luke seems to describe the census is that the Romans decided to take a census in a way that makes no sense. Because Luke seems to be saying that the Romans decided to count the people not where they actually lived, but rather in the places that their ancestors came from. And that, when you think about it, is a pretty silly way to take a census. Because the reason why you take a census, if you are a Roman, is to find all the people, and count all the people, and know where they are, so you can come back and tax them later. You don't want to find and count people where they don't live. That's how censuses are always taken up to this very day. Census takers always take great care to count you only in the place where you primarily reside. And that's how Romans did it too. There's no evidence that they ever took a census in the way that Luke seems to describe in this passage. But what if that's not what Luke meant? What if Luke didn't mean to say that? Because read the passage very clearly, very carefully. Yes, Luke says that Caesar Augustus decided to hold a census and count the people. And he also says that all the people went to their ancestral homes. But he doesn't say that Caesar Augustus told them to do that second thing. What if it was somebody else, somebody other than the Roman authorities, who told the people to go and be counted, not where they lived, but where their ancestors came from? And what if that person was Judas the Galilean? This is what we know about the revolt of Judas the Galilean from the history books. Judas the Galilean was very angry at the Romans, and he was particularly upset, Josephus says, by the census that was taken in 6 AD. And he was especially upset by the heavy taxes that census brought with it. But the other interesting thing about Judas is this. He doesn't seem to be the kind of rebel who used violence or terror as a tool. There are lots of accounts of Judas and his followers and his friends being attacked and killed by the Romans and by the authorities. There are no accounts of Judas and his followers attacking or hurting anyone. So the conclusion has been that basically the rebellion of Judas the Galilean was a non-violent rebellion. It was essentially a protest like the kind of protest that was carried out by Gandhi against British rule in India, or by Martin Luther King Jr. in the civil rights movement in the United States. A demand for change, but not a protest that used violence. Judas the Galilean seems to have had the same approach. Now, Judas's goals, again according to the history books, were three. His goals were to fight against slavery of the people. His goals were to allow the people to regain prosperity and to retain their lands and properties. Those were his goals. Which leads you to good, lofty goals, of course. But you've got to ask, how can you possibly seek to achieve such lofty goals without using any violence or any terror? Well, I think a method of protest may well have suggested itself to Judas from the pages of the Old Testament. But you see, there was a law in the Old Testament called the Jubilee law. And this Jubilee law required that every 50 years a special year be proclaimed, the year of Jubilee. And during this festival of Jubilee, it was basically a celebration of God's gift of the lands to the families of Israel. And the first thing that was supposed to happen during a year of Jubilee was that every family was to get up from where they were living at the time and go back to the place where their ancestors came from. They were to go back to that land. They were to claim it as their own, as God's gift to them. And during the Jubilee in ancient Israel, the land was to be returned to that family. What I think maybe happened was this. The Romans did hold a census. They decided to count all the people. Someone like Judas the Galilean was very upset about this, wanted to disrupt the census without causing any violence or terror. And so what he did was this. He called a Jubilee. He called on all of the people to get up from where they were, to go back to the places where their ancestors came from, and lay claim to those lands, even if no one was going to give it back. The Romans called the census, but somebody called a Jubilee. And I think the somebody who called the Jubilee was Judas the Galilean. He did it to mess with the census, to cause endless headaches to the Roman administrators as they tried to create the tax rolls. He did it to make a point that the land didn't belong to Rome, it belonged to God and to God's people. And that means that for me, Judas the Galilean has a very important role in the whole Christmas story. He's really the one that got things going. Yes, Caesar called the census, but it was Judas the Galilean, or at least someone like him, who got the people stirred up, who got them on the move, who convinced people like Mary and Joseph to go from where they were and to go back to the place that their families came from and claim what was theirs. That's why this year, I'm adding a new character to my nativity scene. Judas the Galilean. I gave you a copy. You can add one to it if you want. And I really do think that there is a place in the Christmas story, in our manger scenes, for someone who did what? Who stood up without resorting, this is important, without resorting to violence, without resorting to terror or such tactics, but who stood up and demanded what the people needed. Their freedom and the means to live a life in the way that God intended for them to live. Judas the Galilean has a place in my Christmas story. Because I think, in a way, that's what Christmas is about. I mean, once you strip away all of the trappings, all of the commercialism, and everything that our modern society has put on Christmas, that's what's left. That God sent someone to revolutionize our lives, to set us free, to be and to have what we need, to be the people God always intended for us to be. Merry Christmas. Take a few moments in silence.